Okay, welcome back. In this video, we are going to talk about the strategy and how you can enchant your clients with stories. So, if you've ever heard the story of 1001 Arabian Nights, you know the power of stories to enchant the listener. That's because people are hardwired to myth for ancient times. They want to hear things spoken in story form, and their subconscious has a way of remembering what they hear in story form better than visual cues. If you use stories in your marketing, you will not only capture people's attention, but you will also help them to remember you long after they've left your website. The other aspect of stories that enchants people is the capacity to create empathy and communion with the storyteller. How many of us remember asking our parents to read a bedtime story? Wasn't it a special time of bonding for us? The same can be true of stories that you tell when you are trying to establish a rapport with people coming to your website or your business. So, what's the strategic plan? The strategy is to try to capture a person's attention by initiating a story that fascinates them into a longer relationship with you. Obviously, they will not leave until they've heard the punchline or found out how the story ended. The story should have some human elements in it so that your reader or listener can relate to it on a personal level. If it's just a story of a product without some human element, it will sound like hype. So be careful to include your product or service in the story, but don't make it a story solely about that product. The story should try to stir the reader's curiosity from the get go. It is this sense of what's going to happen that will lead the reader or viewer deeper and deeper into your story. It can be a story about some people's experience with your product. It can be a story about the development or discovery of your product. It can even be a humorous story about your product. It really doesn't matter as long as you are engaging the reader or listener in a deeper relationship and connection with your product or service. The way you know if the strategy is working is if you can get the reader or viewer to read the entire story to the very end, where the sales pitch is. Once they have become so involved in the storyline, they will empathize with the actors in the story, identify with the product and their own predicaments, and be very likely to consider buying the product right then and there. That's the power of a good story. It breaks down the resistance to buying, much like a set of benefits does too. But in this case, it works more subconsciously than consciously, which makes it far more powerful strategically in the long run. They may leave your website, your store, whatever it may be, and 3 hours later still remember that story. And thus, they will always remember your product better. The deeper the impact of the story, the more likely the reader or viewer will remember your products when they have a need or are looking for a solution like your story relates. So, what's the psychological trigger? Storytelling involves telling jokes as well as long, drawn out stories with a beginning, middle, and end. They work to lessen the awkwardness of a social encounter, especially between people who have never met before. If you can get a person to laugh at your joke or identify with your story, you become more familiar to them and less of a stranger. The impact of a story is only as good as how well it causes the reader or viewer to bond with the storyteller and be drawn into the final conclusion of the story. Jokes are very easy to reel off at the beginning of a sales encounter, but they are much more difficult to enact well. It takes a certain flair to be able to tell a joke well so that it comes out humorous and not lame. However, jokes are brilliant ways to tell a tiny story in a very small amount of time and have people bond with you through the mechanism of human humor and laughter. It builds a warm camaraderie and can help you establish mutual trust from the onset. However, if you're not good at telling jokes, telling a personal account or story can be another great way to bond with your website visitors or viewers. It brings the human element to the forefront of your website and humanizes the technological aspects of being online. It appeals to the subconscious triggers within a person and can be a subtle way to manipulate the unconscious desires or fears they may be experiencing to help them make the decision to buy. So, how do you implement this strategy effectively? Online stories can involve all sorts of media, from written copy to cartoons or video blogs. If you have a good short story that can be made into a video, you can add that to your YouTube channel to try to make it go viral. It can be a story that relates to your product as the solution to an embarrassing event with the title, Don't Let This Happen to You. At the end, you put a link to your website to draw the traffic to your sales page. That's the way to use a video and the power of the internet to create a sales page storyline. It can be very powerful if plenty of people relate to it or find it humorous, as it can be spread across the internet very quickly if it has mass appeal. Another way to use a story is through written copy or your website. Maybe the story has a lesson to teach about why your product is the solution to a particular dilemma. Maybe you want to relate a humorous story about your product that is entertaining for the reader. Maybe you want to give the reader the opportunity to experience an aha moment that some other customer had when they used your product or service. It really doesn't matter what you write, as long as it stirs the reader's curiosity, draws the reader in, and creates a lasting impression. Then, by the time you make your sales pitch, at the end, the story has been embedded in their subconsciousness and will have triggered various impulses to buy. Cartoons or images are like mini stories that can convey a quick synopsis or be a good lead in for a story. If the image captures a visitor's attention enough, they will probably scroll down and read the story behind it. So don't think that this is all about copy. Use everything you can to draw a visitor into the copy that eventually has your sales pitch at the end and a call to action to buy your product. There is one other way to implement this strategy that does not involve actually selling the product. Instead, it could be a story that creates the right environment for your product or educates the reader for why your products are necessary or expedient. This is particularly effective for items that may be so novel that people don't know why they would buy them. There is no conditioning in place or market buzz that has been associated with the item, and so they're left not understanding the value of the product at all. That's when you need a story about your particular industry and how these products were developed to fulfill a particular need. You want to be clear that people understand the results they will get in their lives by paying attention to this particular issue, and this sets the environment for making a sales call at the end. For example, when organic products first came out, only people who were in health food understood the reason for buying higher priced produce or hormone free meats. It just didn't have a mass appeal, and the consumer wasn't really aware that there really was any difference between meat at the local supermarket and meat that was brought up hormone free and cost much more. Why would you pay that much more for something you don't understand or value? So it took a while for people to realize that our air and water systems are polluted and that farms use all kinds of chemicals and fertilizers on produce that end up in vegetables and fruit. So if you happen to be selling some organic products online, you might have a story or environmental stresses that cause your product to be necessary for a healthy diet. Once you declare the proper environment and frame the value of your product or service, it becomes much more intriguing and interesting to your potential buyer. So, what might not have been something they saw any value in becomes very important to try so they too can see the results in their life. So, while a story is typically something that can relate the potential buyer to a common experience that will help them bond, there are other times when you have to set the stage first before they get why it is a common experience. It may be they have never ever tried anything organic in their lives. So you have to introduce the concept to them from some other area that is familiar to them, or polluted environment perhaps. So let's talk about the timing of this strategy. Telling a story that is brief can be done at the very beginning of a sales encounter. It can be done on the home page, in your About Me pages, or when you are introducing a new product. Once you've established a nice bond, you can even get into longer stories on the sales page to establish the benefits of your product, especially if it is something new that needs to have the stage set for it to make a dramatic appearance. You can even use a joke of the day type of device to help engage your reader and have it introduced into your industry, if not your product. Sort of like the jokes that all relate to screwing in a light bulb. If you happen to be selling light bulbs, this would make an excellent way to establish rapport and humor on your site and eventually sell light bulbs. Some people like stories so much that they will email them to other people. You can have an email this story to a friend feature that is a great way to have people visiting your market for you. In the same way, a YouTube video that goes viral will work marketing magic for you, and you don't have to go and post it to too many places. Other people will start doing it for you. Most stories will do nothing more than introduce the product or establish rapport. Those are the ones you use on other sites and throughout the internet to establish a presence online. Reserve the longer, deeper stories for your website where people can become involved in an area that has calls to action to buy your products. I typically like to use a few different examples of this exact thing with dramatic effect. I've told several times the plumbing story and how a plumbing CEO that I'd worked with had been installing water heaters for, about 4 or 5 years, 3, 4 years, and literally going in the whole $200 per installation. Now, I can frame that story in a very enchanting way, add a little bit of drama to it, make it a little bit have a dramatic effect, and it really hits home in my niche. Why? Because it shows an example of how most or some, um, depending on the product or service, most CEOs that have multi-product lines are asleep at the wheel somewhere. So that drives it home and solidifies why many companies want to work with me personally and Miller and Company. So telling stories and enchanting people with stories is a great way to not only bond, but also gain trust, that know, like, and trust factor pretty quickly within side of your sales process to bring clients in faster for your product or service. That concludes this lesson. We'll see you on the next video.